We also stress the importance of additional routes into Gaza, particularly land routes. We acknowledge the announcement by Israel to temporarily open the Erez crossing and to allow the use of the Ashdod port. We hope that these would not be rendered almost useless by burdensome verification processes. In closing, Guyana calls for the upholding of international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Accountability is a critical element of international law, and we urge this Council to ensure that the occupying power does not continue its flagrant violations of international law. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana and pass the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President, and I also want to thank the briefers, Mr. Rajasingham and Ms. Seripto. Colleagues, there are 15 of us around this table in the Security Council, 15 of us with responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza. Were we meeting in the north of Gaza today, all 15 of us would be skipping meals in the past months. 10 of us would go entire days and nights without eating. Half of us would be in desperate need of humanitarian aid. And finally, at least 5 of us would be parents to severely, acutely malnourished children, life-threatening and with lifelong consequences. We are not meeting in Gaza, but listening to Ms. Seripto, maybe we should have met in Gaza. We are meeting at the UN Security Council, where we know very well that looming famine in the north of Gaza and the risk of famine across the rest of the Gaza Strip can be prevented. Conflict-induced and man-made famine means the absolute failure of the international community and gross violation of the international humanitarian law. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. Waiting for a famine declaration will not change anything on the ground, unfortunately. But we know what will: an immediate ceasefire. Full, safe, secure, and unhindered humanitarian access, in particular through land, to provide safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, water, and medicines will. The restoration of health, water, and sanitation services and energy provision will. The adequate shelters for civilians will. Madam President, for the aid to reach people in need, we need humanitarian workers, the most brave and empathetic souls that humanity can produce. They're sacrificing their security, their lives, to save others. They must be able to fulfill their calling without constant fear. They must be granted safety, security, freedom of movement, and the necessary equipment and support. We repeat our continuous call for full respect of international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. This includes ensuring the safety and security of UN and all other personnel engaged in humanitarian relief activities. We are profoundly grateful for the efforts and work of the Secretary General and the entire UN system, in particular UNRWA, UN agencies, humanitarian and medical organizations, and their staff. I want to be clear. Nothing in this war happens by chance. The conduct of this war is a choice. Disrespect of international humanitarian law is a choice. And the consequences of this war, with unprecedented deaths and destruction, and children too weak to cry, cannot be but a choice. With the appalling attack on the World Central Kitchen, earlier on UNRWA, Médecins Sans Frontières, and others, the number of humanitarian workers killed in Gaza has reached 224. We condemn all attacks on humanitarian, medical, and UN personnel in Gaza and underline our call for accountability. The faces of humanity left in Gaza are under attack and have been for the past 6 months. So, colleagues, this Council has adopted 3 resolutions on the situation in Gaza. Most recently, Resolution 2728, calling for an immediate ceasefire leading to a lasting, sustainable ceasefire, the release of hostages, and delivery of humanitarian aid. ICG orders are binding. Security Council resolutions are binding for each and every UN member state. They must be implemented. International order and our collective security depend on respect for the UN Charter, international law, and the commitments that we all adhere to. This Sunday, we will mark 6 months of the war in Gaza. 6 months later, it's imperative to reflect on the enduring suffering of Gaza's civilians and hostages, not merely through discussions, but through decisive, impactful actions. 6 months of destruction and devastation cannot be a milestone we should mark with merely a meeting of the Security Council. We have seen the spillover effects of this conflict in almost the entire Middle East region. The conflict in Gaza is a threat to international peace and security, and this Council should make sure to stop it. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia and pass the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank you for convening this emergency meeting, and we thank the speakers for their presentations. A month ago, this Council met at the request of Guyana and Switzerland as informal focal points on the issue of conflict and hunger, warning of the food insecurity in the Gaza Strip. We had heard the United Nations insisting that without an immediate ceasefire, famine in Gaza was almost inevitable. Despite the adoption of Resolution 2728, which calls for an immediate ceasefire, the fighting continues and food insecurity is further worsened. The lack of access to food and the inadequacy of the water supply, agriculture and food production are catastrophic for the population of the Gaza Strip. Switzerland has the utmost respect for all the humanitarian aid workers who are risking their lives to bring relief. Our thoughts today are with the organizations and families of the over 200 humanitarian workers who have been killed in Gaza since October 7th. Attacks on humanitarian workers are a violation of international humanitarian law and must stop immediately. To this end, concrete deconfliction measures must be put in place. The Gaza Strip has rapidly become the most dangerous place for humanitarian workers. Widespread insecurity and restrictions on movement are forcing humanitarian organizations to suspend their operations at a time when humanitarian needs are greatest. As a result, the entire aid system is in danger of collapsing, and the continuation of the maritime aid corridor from Cyprus is in particular jeopardy. UNRWA and other humanitarian organizations must have unhindered access to the population in need. Every day counts. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, has warned of a risk of famine between now and the end of May 2024. According to UNICEF, Gaza is experiencing the worst level of child malnutrition in the world. Malnutrition in early life can lead to stunted growth, impaired cognitive development, and increased vulnerability to infection and disease. These impacts are irreversible and will affect these children for the rest of their lives. Madam President, Switzerland recalls that the provisional measures decided by the ICJ on 26 January and 28 March 2024 are binding for the parties. On 28 March 2024, the ICJ asked Israel to work closely with the UN to ensure the unrestricted and large-scale provision by all interested parties of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian aid. We therefore expect Israel to comply, and once again, we call on the parties to comply strictly with international law, in particular international humanitarian law and human rights law. Switzerland remains very concerned about the impact of the hostilities on the civilian population. A large-scale operation in Rafah must not take place, given the catastrophic humanitarian consequences it would have. In addition, Council Resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728 must be implemented as a matter of urgency. All hostages still held in Gaza must be released immediately and unconditionally. An immediate ceasefire leading to a lasting and sustainable ceasefire is essential to protect lives and prevent starvation. Without reliable security guarantees, humanitarians cannot fulfill their mandate to save lives and to help people in need. We must return to humanity. An immediate ceasefire is the only way to ensure that no more civilian lives are lost. Thank you.
Representative of Switzerland, and pass the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I join others in thanking Director Rajasingham and President Siripto for briefing us today. The UK is appalled by the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers, including 3 of our British nationals, in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza on the 1st of April, bringing the number of humanitarian staff killed so far to over 200. I share our deep and sincere condolences with their families and with all those who have lost loved ones during this war. Our Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary spoke immediately with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Israeli Foreign Minister Katz to ask for a transparent investigation. We will study carefully the results of the investigation from the Israeli government, and we welcome the commitments Israel has made since on humanitarian operations. President, aid workers should never be targeted. Over 200 have been killed in this conflict. Israel must do much more to protect them and to ensure their safety so they can deliver urgently needed, life-saving humanitarian assistance. For this to happen, we call for 3 major changes. First, Israel must make significant, concrete changes to put in place an effective deconfliction mechanism immediately. It is imperative that those doing life-saving work are properly protected and allowed full, unhindered access to conduct their work safely. Second, we welcome the steps Israel has now taken and call on it to do everything necessary to allow effective humanitarian relief. We welcome the assurances that Israel has given to UN agencies and others that it will now open Ashdod port, more land crossings into Gaza, increase quantities and types of aid allowed to enter by land, and improve water supplies. The amount of aid getting in has, until now, been insufficient. Full, unhindered access, as well as an enabling operating environment for distribution, is necessary to meet humanitarian needs and avoid famine. And all parties must comply fully with international humanitarian law and work with Under-Secretary-General Karg to scale up assistance and implement Resolution 2720 without delay. Finally, we need to see major and immediate changes in the conduct of Israel's military campaign to protect civilians. I reiterate the UK's call for the immediate implementation of Resolution 2728. This weekend, it will be 6 months since Israel suffered the worst terror attack in its history. Throughout this crisis, the UK has been unequivocal in our condemnation of Hamas and our demand for the unconditional release of the hostages. We must see an immediate cessation of hostilities to get aid in and hostages out, leading to progress towards a sustainable ceasefire. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and pass the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam Chair, we'd like to thank Director of UN OCHA Ramesh Rajasingham
Okay. My goodness, what an eventful morning today. One for the memoirs.
It's an aftershock of the earthquake. Shall I continue?
Yes, please continue.
Madam Chair, we'd like to thank the Director from UN OCHA, Ramesh Rajasingham, and Ms. Yanti Saripto, a civil society representative, for their briefings about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, where, despite UN Security Council Resolution 2728, which demands an immediate ceasefire, the ruthless military operation of the IDF continues. Until the end of the Muslim world's holy month of Ramadan, well, it's ending in just 4 days' time. But judging by the bellicose rhetoric of the leadership of West Jerusalem, no truce, which is directly demanded by Resolution 2728, even for this short stretch of time, is foreseen. As a result, in the last 24 hours alone, in the enclave, 62 people died. The total number of lives claimed in the Gaza Strip is over 33,000 Palestinians. Of them, 13,000 are children. Roughly 12,000, in addition, are assumed killed. Their bodies are buried under the ruins into which practically the entire territory of the enclave has turned into. 70% of buildings have been destroyed. Against this backdrop, the Human Rights Council Special Rapporteur on the humanitarian human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, Ms. Albanese, concluded that Israel has met the threshold for committing the crime of genocide. At the same time, Ms. Albanese called this a humanitarian camouflage. That is, the Israeli authorities' assertion that international humanitarian law is supposedly being upheld during the military operation in the Gaza Strip, as well as Israel's references to self-defense and the fight against terrorism in this context. Madam President, with each passing day, the humanitarian situation in Gaza continues to deteriorate. Every single day, we get more and more chilling data delivered to us. We'd like to repeat our position. In order to prevent a humanitarian apocalypse and mass hunger in Gaza, what we urgently need is a genuine ceasefire, and for Israel to respect international humanitarian law. That is the only way to avoid further victims in this tragedy. With the military operation in the Strip ongoing, adequate provision of humanitarian, including food assistance, is impossible. Since the escalation in Gaza began, the Security Council has adopted 2 dedicated humanitarian resolutions, which, just like the resolution which calls for a ceasefire, demands a ceasefire 2728, contain provisions about unfettered humanitarian access to those in need and unconditional respect for the obligations established by international humanitarian law to ensure minimal conditions for the work of humanitarian aid agencies. Israel isn't fulfilling those either. We believe that the Council needs to agree on measures which should be adopted vis-à-vis West Jerusalem in response to Israel's flagrant disregard of Security Council decisions and the UN Charter. For example, these measures could include an arms embargo or other types of sanctions. In so doing, the Council should stand in unison. It's unacceptable for some members of the Council to send signals which cast doubt on the need to implement resolutions being adopted by the Council. Madam President, palliative measures won't improve the situation in the Gaza Strip. These palliative measures include humanitarian aid drops and the building of a temporary maritime pier. Aid agencies themselves have concluded that these measures are purely symbolic in nature. They don't help the regular provision of assistance at scale. What's more is, dozens of Palestinians perished and drowned when these measures were implemented. Now is not the time for humanitarian PR, which is being used as a cover for the unwillingness or the inability to take measures to end the bloodshed and ensure the safe and unhindered access for humanitarian assistance. Madam President, the situation is significantly exacerbated by Israel hyping up the crisis surrounding UNRWA, which is a unique body providing comprehensive assistance to 6 million Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory and in neighboring Arab states. And yet, Israel hasn't submitted information confirming the allegations it leveled against UNRWA staff. Despite this, Washington took a legislative decision to bar funding to UNRWA. At the same time, a series of Western states, although they did resume their contributions to the organization's budget, they did so on the reservation that these funds shouldn't be used to finance the work of the agency in Gaza. A few words about the information war being waged by Western Jerusalem against UNRWA. As a result of groundless allegations, the veracity of which raises serious doubts, the agency is facing serious reputational and financial difficulties. But that's not the main thing. The main thing is that even the modest assistance that could be provided right now by this UN body isn't actually being provided as a result. To top it all off, Israel has denied humanitarian access to northern Gaza for UNRWA. Northern Gaza being the place where the situation is most dire. This obstruction must come to an end. We all understand full well that in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in contiguous Arab states, there is no alternative to UNRWA. Council members shouldn't play along with Israel, which has begun a crusade against UNRWA and did so long before the events of the 7th of October of last year. A few words about the security of humanitarian assistance workers. On Tuesday, as a result of targeted Israeli strikes, 7 staff working for a volunteer organization, World Central Kitchen, lost their lives. These people were escorting food aid, which is something Gazans so direly need. This incident prompted an outcry and outrage in Western capitals, as among the dead were mainly Western nationals. Washington even went so far as to level an unusually sharp criticism at its Middle Eastern ally. On the whole, over the course of the conflict, Israel's missile strikes on humanitarian objects in Gaza, on schools and hospitals have claimed the lives of 224 humanitarian aid workers, not to mention the tens of thousands of Gazans who've lost their lives. Yet again, we'd like to ask a simple question. Will these atrocities be investigated? Will the Council demand this from Israel? Or are our Western colleagues only paying attention to instances where their own nationals die? What does the UN Secretariat's leadership plan to do? It's already lost 179 staff which were discharging their heroic duty. Why did the UN get to work on Israel's allegations against UNRWA immediately? But when it comes to these flagrant cases where UN staff have perished, as far as we can tell, the investigation of these instances hasn't even begun. Madam President, in essence, what we are seeing in Gaza right now is a blockade, the goal being provoking hunger among the civilian population. It's a clear example of hunger being used as a warfare tactic. We'd like to remind you that such actions are directly prohibited by international humanitarian law, as well as the relevant UN Security Council Resolution 2417. The occupying power's decision to temporarily open the Eretz border crossing was adopted on the eve of this meeting to dial down the aforementioned outrage in Western capitals, but it doesn't change the overall picture. The Security Council's main demand, an immediate ceasefire, is something Israel still hasn't implemented. The Security Council is duty-bound to secure the implementation in full by all parties to the conflict of all of its decisions geared towards ending violence in Gaza, scaling up humanitarian assistance to civilians in the Strip, and preventing forced relocation thereof. Only then can we begin thinking about new initiatives to achieve the long-term settlement of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict within the international legal framework we have. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation and pass the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Mr. Rajanshinan and Ms. Soelipto for their valuable briefings. We are nearing 6 months since the conflict in Gaza erupted due to Hamas' terrifying attacks on Israel. Recent developments only seem to be worsening the situation on the ground. Despite last week's adoption of Security Council Resolution 2728, demanding immediate ceasefire during the holy month of Ramadan, hostilities continue unabated. On April 2nd, we witnessed the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen aid workers by multiple Israeli strikes in Gaza, sparkling global outrage. Already, more than 220 humanitarian workers lost their lives. Japan extends sincere condolences to the colleagues and the families of the victims. These incidents have forced humanitarian organizations to suspend their operations, which create catastrophic impacts on the lives of people in Gaza, who desperately need life-saving assistance. Attacks on humanitarian workers are absolutely unacceptable. In this vein, Japan urges Israel for necessary measures to prevent recurrence of such incidents. Humanitarian crisis in Gaza is spiraling deeper into catastrophe. People in Gaza face starvation, the spread of preventable diseases, and unimaginable suffering. Famine is there. Even though many countries, including Japan, have resumed funding for UNRWA, if attacks on humanitarian workers continue, they cannot carry out their work. This week, we heard from the representative from UNICEF that dozens of children in northern Gaza have reportedly died from malnutrition and dehydration. We must exert all our efforts to getting aid into Gaza through all possible means, including by land, air, and sea. Those in Gaza cannot wait another day. Japan hopes the recent announcement regarding the opening of the Izez crossing will allow more humanitarian aid to reach people in Gaza. For this catastrophic nightmare to end, Japan urges all concerned parties to achieve an immediate ceasefire. The imperative to improve the humanitarian situation without further delay in accordance with the Security Council Resolution 2728. We must save the lives of civilians, including innocent children, by silencing the guns, expediting humanitarian deliveries into Gaza, and working towards the release of hostages. Lastly, we remain strongly supportive of the ongoing diplomatic efforts led by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar to this end. We will continue to play our role in achieving peace and stability in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan and pass the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I thank Algeria, Guyana, and Slovenia for the initiative to convene today's meeting, and thanks the 2 briefers for their briefings. It has been 6 months since the conflict in Gaza erupted. More than 33,000 innocent civilians have lost their lives in the fighting, with millions more struggling in despair in the midst of an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. The Security Council adopted Resolution 2728 on March 25th, calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. However, it is heartbreaking that the fighting has continued for more than 10 days, with civilians and humanitarian workers in Gaza exposed to daily gunfire and bullets. Every day, hundreds of innocent women and children die from bombings, hunger, and disease. The tragedy of Gaza tests the conscience of humanity and the credibility of the Security Council. First, The full implementation of Resolution 2728 must be taken as a matter of urgency. All resolutions of the Security Council are binding. It is the obligation of every member state to implement the resolutions and the commitment all have made when joining the UN. We urge Israel to implement the resolution immediately and cease its military attacks on Gaza and its collective punishment of the people of Gaza. We call on the major powers with significant influence on the parties concerned to play an active role in promoting the implementation of the resolution. We support the Security Council in taking further necessary action to implement Resolution 2728. Second, there's no time to lose in alleviating the humanitarian disaster. Gaza is already suffering from severe famine and the collapse of the medical system. The humanitarian disaster is beyond imagination. Israel must fully implement the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice and immediately lift the blockade of Gaza and the obstacles to humanitarian access. Rafah and all land crossings must be fully opened to allow for the rapid, adequate, and safe passage of humanitarian supplies. Third, Israel must cease its attacks on humanitarian institutions and personnel. The recent attacks on the humanitarian convoys is strongly condemned by China. The attacks on humanitarian workers is shocking. It also warned us that since the outbreak of the conflict, Israel's attacks has already claimed the lives of over 170 humanitarian workers. The life-saving humanitarian facilities and supplies have been damaged. Israel must abide by the international law and international humanitarian law and supply to provide assistance to the humanitarian agencies and the security guarantee. They must stop the malicious attacks and restraint on UNRWA. Madam President, the lessons of the current round of conflicts are tragic. They remind us once again that only through the full implementation of the two-state solution, the realization of an independent Palestinian state, and the correction of the historical injustice long suffered by the Palestinian people will it be possible to break out the vicious cycle of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. As the first step, the key is we need to support Palestinian full membership in the UN and support action by the Security Council as soon as possible. At the same time, we advocate for the convening of a larger, more authoritative and more effective international peace conference to develop the timeline and pathway for realization of the two-state solution. China will continue to work with the international community and make unremitting efforts to put an end to the fighting in Gaza so as to alleviate the humanitarian disaster and realize a two-state solution. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China and pass the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, I'd like to thank Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham and Ms. Saripto for their briefings. France condemned Israel's strike, which resulted in the death of 7 World Central Kitchen NGO workers. We've asked the Israeli authorities to conduct an in-depth investigation so as to not let the perpetrators go unpunished. They've committed to this and they must uphold that commitment. So 7 humanitarian workers died when they were trying to assist civilian populations, which are basically facing famine. Their deaths come on top of 177 UNRWA staff. Let's not forget that. For the United Nations, that's the highest death toll since the organization was established. The protection of humanitarian aid workers must be upheld under all circumstances. The laws of war and the principles of precaution and proportionality during hostilities must be upheld. 2 million people lack everything in Gaza. It's therefore vital that we provide massive humanitarian assistance and to guarantee full access in keeping with the resolutions adopted by this Council. The United Nations coordinating role is essential here, as is that of UNRWA. France has taken note of the measures announced by the Israeli government today. We call on the government to implement its announcements without delay and to fully respect international humanitarian law. Madam President, France demands the full implementation of Resolution 2728 of the Security Council, as well as an immediate and lasting ceasefire. In Gaza, we're not seeing a natural disaster. The humanitarian catastrophe is a result of war, and the best humanitarian response is for the war to end. France would like to reiterate its staunch opposition to a ground offensive in Rafah, which would result in a humanitarian catastrophe on an unprecedented scale. We also demand the immediate and unconditional release of hostages detained by Hamas and other terrorist groups. We'd like to reiterate our condemnation of terrorist attacks, including sexual violence, which have been committed on the 7th of October. Madam President, achieving a ceasefire is a top priority for France. Let's address the root cause, not just the symptoms of this problem. It is high time for us to, at last, lay the groundwork for a political settlement so as to implement the two-state solution. This solution is the only way to furnish Israelis and Palestinians with peace and security. France is actively engaged to this end, working with parties and all regional and international partners. The draft resolution, which we've submitted for the consideration of Security Council members, is part and parcel of this effort. I call on all Council members to express their support for that resolution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France and pass the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to begin by thanking this morning's briefers, Mr. Rajasingham and Ms. Saripto, for their timely and grim reports. I reiterate Ecuador's support for the brave and self-sacrificing work of UN staff and agencies in the conflict zone. I also would like to acknowledge and commend the heroic work of the humanitarian staff who, since the condemnable terrorist acts carried out by Hamas last October, are risking their lives to provide food and to save lives in increasingly difficult conditions. I pay particular tribute to the humanitarian staff who've lost their lives in this conflict, in particular the 7 World Central Kitchen staff killed this week, and we extend our condolences to their countries of origin and their families. This morning, the Secretary General explicitly referred to this matter. Madam President, humanitarian staff must not be the target of attacks ever, under any circumstances, under any pretext. There is no justification whatsoever for this to happen. These types of acts must be investigated, and those responsible must be held to account. The compliance with the principles of international humanitarian law are not voluntary and do not require reciprocity. The suspension of humanitarian activities due to a lack of minimal protection and security standards has worsened the already very serious food crisis. We must reverse this situation. To that end, the work of UNRWA is vitally important and requires support, and we call on those in a position to do so to make a financial contribution to their operations. Their continued work is a factor of stability throughout the region. Madam President, last week the Security Council adopted a resolution calling for the immediate ceasefire during the month of Ramadan and the unconditional and immediate release of hostages who remain in the hands of Hamas. At the same time, Resolution 2728 points to the need to increase the flow of humanitarian assistance to Gaza. The timely implementation of this Council decision would have avoided the death of humanitarian staff, it would have enabled the hostages to be reunited with their families, and it would have increased aid to the civilian population. For this reason, we reiterate our appeal for the full and immediate implementation of Resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728 in order to avoid further death and destruction. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ecuador and pass the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Director Raja Singhang for today's briefing on the situation in the Gaza Strip. I also appreciate Ms. Sueripto for her sobering testimony on what is happening on the ground. As we are now nearing 6 months since the current catastrophe started, it is gravely dismaying to witness that hostilities continue unabated, causing devastating humanitarian consequences in Gaza. 3 days ago, the WHO announced Al-Shifa Medical Complex in Gaza City, the largest hospital in Gaza, is no longer functional after Israel's military operation, further threatening the already precarious health system in the Gaza Strip. Despite international efforts, including through maritime corridors and airdrops, Gaza is now facing a catastrophic food crisis due to the significant restrictions to land deliveries of life-saving assistance in unsafe conditions. As civilian infrastructure for food production and distribution has been severely damaged, Gaza cannot sustain itself without outside assistance. Against this disturbing backdrop, my delegation is deeply appalled by the killing of 7 World Central Kitchen staff members in an IDF strike, who were simply delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance in the Gaza Strip. It is reported the World Central Kitchen alone has provided more than 35 million hot meals across Gaza since the outset of the current catastrophe. Korea extends its deep condolences and consolations to the victims of this incident and their bereaved families, and wishes a speedy recovery for the injured. Now, several key humanitarian aid organizations on the ground, including World Central Kitchen, are reported to have suspended the operations following this devastating incident. This is dismaying development, as the international community is struggling to expand the humanitarian aid at scale throughout Gaza. Madam President, let me clearly repeat our shared tenet enshrined in international humanitarian laws. All parties to conflicts must not attack humanitarian workers, and they must ensure unhindered access to humanitarian assistance. All barriers to the provisions of humanitarian assistance in Gaza should be lifted as demanded by a Security Council Resolution 2728. We hope Israeli government's announcements yesterday on steps to increase aid flow to Gaza leads to tangible improvements on the ground. At the same time, humanitarian notification procedures and deconfliction mechanisms should be enhanced to stop recurrence of incidents like the deaths of World Central Kitchen member staffs. Korea re-emphasized that Resolution 2720 adopted last month should be implemented and calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, as this is the only viable way to ensure safe and unimpeded access to humanitarian assistance. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea and pass the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And thank you for your briefings, Director Raja Singham and CEO Sueripto. The Security Council and General Assembly have affirmed the imperative of protecting humanitarian personnel, including Resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. As we have heard today, tragically, this has not been heeded by the parties in Gaza. One of the most recent pieces of evidence of this was the tragic strike on a World Central Kitchen convoy, which killed several humanitarian workers on April 1. As President Biden said on Tuesday, the United States is outraged and heartbroken at the deaths of these individuals who were providing food to starving civilians in the middle of a war. These workers were brave and selfless. They show the best of what humanity has to offer when the going really gets tough. An incident such as this should never have happened and must never happen again. We all know, moreover, this was not a standalone incident. This conflict has been one of the worst in recent memory in terms of the number of aid workers who have been killed. More than 220 humanitarian workers have perished since October 7th in Gaza, some while on duty. Many more have been injured. These incidents are unacceptable. Humanitarian personnel must be protected, full stop. We are deeply concerned Israel has not done enough to protect humanitarian aid workers or civilians. For that reason, the resolution the United States introduced last month in this council demanded all parties to the conflict fully respect humanitarian notification and deconfliction mechanisms and remediate any deficiencies. Although Russia and China vetoed that resolution, we repeat that call today. As President Biden conveyed to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on April 4th, Israel must announce and implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers. U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by Israel's immediate action on these steps. Given the serious allegations regarding UNRWA personnel tied to Hamas, we fully support the ongoing investigations into the organization and look forward to the independent review conducted by former French Foreign Minister Colonna. At the same time, however, we note UNRWA's indispensable role in distributing humanitarian assistance in Gaza, especially given a looming famine. Onerous restrictions on UNRWA's work are unacceptable, especially given grave concerns about looming famine. Of course, even as we press Israel to do much more to protect humanitarian workers and facilitate the life-saving work of the UN, including UNRWA, we must not ignore how Hamas's actions have put humanitarian personnel at risk. Tunneling under and storing weapons in hospitals is a violation of the laws of war, and we condemn it. We also continue to do all we can to help deliver humanitarian assistance to Palestinian civilians in Gaza through all available means. But these actions are not enough to meet the needs of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. Humanitarian assistance is desperately needed now, and it must be facilitated to mitigate the impact of an impending famine. Gaza's entire population knows acute levels of food insecurity. Gaza's entire population is in need of humanitarian assistance. That is why we continue to underscore an immediate ceasefire is essential to stabilize and improve the humanitarian situation and protect innocent lives. And we have urged Prime Minister Netanyahu to empower his negotiators to conclude a deal without delay to bring the hostages home. We urge Hamas as well to accept the deal on the table. We continue to support these negotiations and will continue to work to protect humanitarian staff and facilitate increased provision of humanitarian assistance into and throughout Gaza. And with that, I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States and pass the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting at the request of Algeria, joined by Guyana and Slovenia, to receive an update on the risk of famine and attacks against humanitarian workers in the occupied Palestinian territory, in particular the Gaza Strip. I thank Director Rajasingham and I thank Ms. Janti Sorepto for their important information and sobering briefing. A couple of days ago, in this chamber, we had a briefing during which we were presented with the devastating impact of the Gaza conflict on children. The report from Global Nutrition Cluster, referenced during that briefing, indicated that approximately 15% of children under 2 years of age in northern Gaza are acutely malnourished, and that the region is facing imminent famine. Several other open briefings have been held on the region since the start of the year, and in all of these meetings, we have been briefed about the unremitting Israeli bombardment of Gaza that has decimated almost all public and private infrastructure and has halted socio-economic activity in Gaza. Markets, private enterprises, and financial institutions, the bedrock of economic activity, are non-functioning in Gaza. Infrastructure for essential services like water, sanitation, energy, and health have been decimated. The global community is aware of the results of the 2-week military operation in the Al-Shifa hospital, which has left most of the hospital structure in ruins. The numbers regarding civilian casualties and internally displaced persons, with women and children being the most affected, are profound and must not be normalized. Despite the volatility in the region and the dangers they face, humanitarian workers have remained resolute in assisting civilians to access food and life-saving aid needed for their daily survival. We recall resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728, which demand parties to the conflict to comply with their obligations under international law, to protect civilians, and the need to allow for full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access to all parts in the Gaza Strip. These resolutions of the Security Council are binding, and we are deeply concerned about the glaring non-compliance by the parties. We are also deeply concerned that civilians and humanitarian personnel are still being victims of strikes, often leading to their demise. The United Nations Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator for the Occupied Palestinian Territory has recently reported that at that stage in the conflict, at least 196 humanitarian personnel have been killed in the occupied Palestinian territory. The update from Director Rajasingham puts the tragic total at 226 humanitarian workers killed, 179 of which are UN personnel. Hundreds of humanitarian workers have paid the ultimate price, from the honorary Palestinian humanitarian workers to the World Central Kitchen workers. We offer our deepest condolences to their families and the organizations. Madam President, each day we're reminded of the risk of famine and the steep rise in malnutrition due to intense hostilities and restricted humanitarian access. OCHA has reported that at least 576,000 people in Gaza are one step away from famine and are facing catastrophic levels of deprivation and starvation. To minimize the impact of the dire humanitarian situation amidst these projections of food insecurity and famine, malnutrition, and disease, my delegation would like to emphasize the following. Firstly, Sierra Leone condemns all attacks against civilians and humanitarian personnel. They must stop, and effective deconfliction measures to deliver humanitarian aid implemented. Secondly, we continue to strongly urge the parties to the conflict to respect the resolution of this Council by implementing Resolution 2712, 2720, and 2728. Thirdly, we reaffirm the relevance and validity of the International Court of Justice provisional measures ordered of 26 January 2024 and a request for modification order made on 28 March 2024, which inter alia obligates the State of Israel to ensure without delay full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale by all concerned of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance, including food, water, electricity, fuel, shelter, clothing, hygiene and sanitation requirements throughout Gaza. Fourthly, Sierra Leone emphasizes the importance and imperative for accountability for the grave violations of international law by all responsible parties. As we call for peace, it must be accompanied by accountability to end impunity. Sierra Leone reiterates its position on the vital role of UNRWA amidst the myriad of factors impeding their humanitarian response. The need for their continued services cannot be overstated, as UNRWA remains the bedrock for the provision of life-saving humanitarian services to Palestinians across the Middle East region. Let me close, Madam President, by echoing the need for the intensification of political engagement, dialogue, to persistently pursue peace, premise on the two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone and pass the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I wish to thank Malta's presidency for convening this urgent meeting on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. Our gratitude goes to Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, Director of Coordination at OCHA, and Ms. Janti Sueripto, President and Chief Executive Officer of Save the Children US. Madam President, about 11 days ago, this Council overwhelmingly adopted Resolution 2728, tabled by the 10 elected members of this important organ. The purpose and object of that resolution was clear and unambiguous. A, to achieve an immediate and lasting ceasefire. B, to obtain the release of hostages. And C, to allow for the flow of humanitarian aid in larger quantities that could address the humanitarian tragedy presently unfolding in Gaza. We, members of the Security Council, adopted Resolution 2728 because of our unanimous stand that the death of children, women, and men in Gaza is unacceptable, and it defies our conscience, our humanity, and the principles and purposes enshrined in the United Nations Charter. The adoption of that resolution was a clear testament that no member of this Council could find it justified or justifiable the relentless military operation in Gaza, a military operation that is causing untold suffering of the Palestinian people. This is a critical situation that demands the immediate attention and concerted efforts of on our part in order to protect the people in Gaza. Madam President, of great concern to all of us is the fact that the ongoing military action appears to respect no laws of war, no rules of warfare, no boundaries of morality. The large number, more than 200 so far, of tragic deaths of humanitarian workers bears testimony to that assertion. The recent death of the World Central Kitchen workers in Gaza illustrates the dimension of the tragedy. The loss of these dedicated humanitarian workers is highly deplorable. These and other humanitarian workers who perished in Gaza were people solely devoted to providing essential aid to those in need. Their deaths constitutes a flagrant violation of the relevant provisions of international humanitarian law and of human rights law. We deeply regret the attack of Al-Shifa Hospital, which is in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which underscores the critical importance of safeguarding civilian health units and maternity wards during armed conflicts. Madam President, we welcome the recent additional International Court of Justice order on the Gaza question. It mandates that Israel must take specific measures to address the crippling shortages of essential supplies in the war-ravaged Gaza Strip. This underscores the urgency of addressing the humanitarian crisis and ensuring that aid reaches those in need. In this regard, we urge Israel to address the humanitarian crisis in Gaza by implementing measures to improve the situation. These measures include opening more land crossings to facilitate the entry of essential supplies such as food, water, and fuel into the war-affected Gaza. We urge member states to fully cooperate with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. The agency plays a vital role in providing humanitarian aid to the population in Palestine. UNRWA's assistance is essential to the well-being of civilians in that region. Madam President, as we labor for the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2728 and other resolutions of this organ, we should continue fighting for a peaceful and stable future in the Middle East that hinges on a vision of a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, living side by side as independent and sovereign states and coexisting as good neighbors as prescribed by the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Mozambique. I will now make a statement in my national capacity. I begin by thanking the briefers for their statements. We are deeply shocked by Israel's killing of 7 aid workers from World Central Kitchen in Gaza on 1st April. This brings the total number of humanitarians killed in this latest round of conflict in Gaza to more than 220, with 179 of these UN personnel. A number increasing day by day. We express our sincere condolences to the loved ones of all those UN and humanitarian personnel killed in Gaza. Malta calls for a thorough, independent, and urgent investigation into this completely unacceptable event and all previous ones. Accountability for any violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, must be ensured. Perpetrators must be held accountable. The latest attack once again underlines the urgent need for an immediate and permanent ceasefire. We note that the movement of the humanitarian staff from World Central Kitchen was carried out in coordination with Israeli authorities, who were notified through the UN's humanitarian notification system. All procedures were followed, and yet this attack still happened. We stress once again that these systems are in place to ensure that these exact incidents do not take place. We recall the international humanitarian law obligations of all parties to protect humanitarian workers. Strikes on humanitarian workers are unacceptable, especially when these are providing much-needed humanitarian assistance to civilians in need. It is clear that more must be done to ensure full compliance with these obligations. On this occasion, I emphasize once again our firm conviction that UNRWA is a stabilizing force in Gaza and in the region, and there is no replacement to the services it provides. Member States must make sure that UNRWA can implement its operations in line with its mandate and that relief workers are protected. We call upon Member States to continue to contribute to the agency and ensure that it has the necessary resources to operate. We continue to observe obstacles being imposed by Israel, preventing the safe, rapid and unhindered facilitation of humanitarian assistance into and within Gaza. Since the outbreak of this conflict, Israel has obstructed a meaningful humanitarian aid scale-up in Gaza by placing onerous, arbitrary, bureaucratic and administrative impediments on aid delivery. Tent poles, chemotherapy drugs and basic commodities are being blocked from entering Gaza. Furthermore, it continues to block food from reaching Gazans who are in desperate need. According to the latest data, the entire population of the Gaza Strip is facing crisis levels of hunger. Around 500,000 people are on the verge of man-made and conflict-induced famine. More needs to be done. We cannot simply wait for a retrospective famine classification before acting to prevent it. Within this context, we deeply regret that the World Central Kitchen has now been forced to suspend its operations and to return large consignments of undelivered food due to the fear of further attacks. Malta underlines that Resolution 2417 clearly states that the use of starvation as a weapon of war may constitute a war crime. We further stress that Israel must facilitate the use of all available routes and border crossings to and throughout the Gaza Strip. The announced opening of the Erez crossing and the Karim Sharam opening and the Ashdod port is a necessary and positive development. The full and rapid implementation of these measures is fundamental. We are also deeply shocked by images of the aftermath of the Israeli military siege on Al-Shifa Hospital. Any systematic targeting of civilians using hospitals and medical facilities or their improper use by the parties is in direct contravention of international humanitarian law and Resolution 2286. This resolution, as well as all other Security Council resolutions, must be respected and implemented. Finally, Malta reiterates its firm position that de-escalation and dialogue are the only ways to allow the necessary space to relaunch negotiations for a just, comprehensive, and peaceful resolution of this conflict based on the two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders. I thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Madam President, just a few minutes ago, we bore witness to a cynical attempt and an inexcusable attempt at manipulation on the part of our US colleagues. In his statement, the U.S. representative stressed the fact that the call to protect humanitarian aid workers was contained in a U.S. draft resolution that was vetoed by Russia and China. Having said that, he cunningly kept quiet about the fact that UN Security Council Resolution 2728 contains a similar demand by referring to the requirement to implement Resolution 2720 on this very issue. He also kept quiet about the fact that the draft resolution be vetoed, and rightly so. That draft resolution didn't contain a requirement or even a call for a ceasefire. Having said that, the U.S. representative de facto gave the green light to the Israeli Operation Rafah. Colleagues, we believe that such low standards is something that has no place in the diplomacy of the Security Council. Instead of these dirty tricks, our colleagues from the U.S. would be better placed to focus on exerting pressure on Israel and also to end arms supplies to Israel, which are being used to kill Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, Council members, dear colleagues, we want to express our appreciation to Algeria, Guyana, and Slovenia for convening this important meeting today. And I want also to add to express our appreciation to the unanimous decision by the Arab group yesterday requesting through our representative, the ambassador of Algeria, to ask for this meeting and the two other countries, Guyana and Slovenia, for joining in this endeavor. I want also to thank the two briefers from OCHA and Save the Children, Mr. Raja Singham and Madam Sorepto, for their briefings. Madam President, allow me to address you today not only in your capacity as diplomats representing your states, but as parents and grandparents, as daughters and sons, as members of families that you love and cherish. Last night, a Palestinian father sat powerless by the bedside of his 2-month-old baby, watching him die slowly of hunger. After searching for hours and days for baby formula in northern Gaza to no avail. A mother had to leave her children in their home for their safety while she went out to try and find flour. She heard a loud bombardment as she reached the street's corner, rushed back with no flour, only to find her home destroyed and her kids killed. We speak of this terrifying assault against life in Gaza in days and months, 180 days, 6 months. But parents calculate in hours, agonize in minutes and seconds, and they wonder, how much longer will they have to wait? How much longer can they preserve shreds of life before them too? They are torn apart. To how many children will they have to bid an eternal farewell? Or how many children will they leave behind if they are to perish? Israel has destroyed the homes, killed entire families, displaced the entire population, demolished the hospitals, and made every effort to ensure no help could reach our people. It is killing those who heal, those who rescue, those who provide aid and relief, those who feed, those who report. Being a Palestinian is enough to be killed. Trying to help Palestinians like this brave woman and their organization is enough to be killed. You saw it over 2 weeks in a Shifa hospital, where Israel summarily executed people, arrested and tortured them, including the wounded and the sick and medical personnel, without feeling the need to provide much explanation or any evidence. It then burned down the most important hospital in the entire Gaza Strip, continuing to bring the health system to its knees at the time it is most needed to save lives. We present our deepest condolences to the families of medical personnel, of rescue teams members, and of over 200 aid workers who have been killed, and express our admiration to all the humanitarians who are pursuing their sacred mission at the peril of their lives. They should not be abandoned, but rather supported and protected. The killing of the aid workers from the World Central Kitchen is not an isolated incident. It is confirmation of what you all knew for months now. Israel is targeting those that the laws of war were established to protect. Israel knew very well who it was targeting, hitting 3 cars in 3 locations, despite the fact that they were identifiable and had coordinated with Israel the delivery of aid. It says it suspected 1 person, so it killed many. Never mind distinction, precautions, proportionality, protected status, never mind human decency. It is unfortunate that it took the killing of foreign nationals for some to fully acknowledge the fate reserved to Palestinians for 180 days now. As the World Central Kitchen CEO eloquently said, and I quote, "This is not only an attack against WCK, this is an attack on humanitarian organizations showing up in the most dire of situations where food is being used as a weapon of war. This is unforgivable," end of quotation. It is even more unforgivable that Israel, as occupying power, is the one with responsibility in ensuring that the civilian population is not harmed or starved, and instead it is not only inflicting such harm and starvation, but also killing those trying to alleviate them. For Israel, the entire civilian population and anyone helping them and the entire civilian infrastructure are legitimate targets. It's enough to call them, quote unquote, collateral damage, express grief, and move on to committing the next crime. Israel baselessly argued that the problem was in the organization delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance, UNRWA, whose role is fundamental and who is doing heroic work on the ground. Now, even the NGOs who have worked in the worst possible circumstances around the world are saying they cannot operate in Gaza because of the environment created by Israel. Madam President, Israel, while killing with its bombs and bullets over 32,000 Palestinians and maiming over 72,000 Palestinians, have also made sure to create a man-made famine, the worst of its kind, affecting over 2 million people, besieged and starved, with tons of assistance by a few kilometers away. Who can still speak of shared values with Israel that is committing such crimes without being devoured by shame? This council finally demanded an immediate ceasefire, leading to a lasting and sustainable ceasefire. Israel ignored this demand. Resolution 2728 must be implemented. It is the responsibility of this council and all states to ensure that it is upheld. The ICJ ordered Israel twice in the last 2 months to undertake measures to prevent the real and imminent threat of genocide, including to take all necessary and effective measures to ensure without delay, in full cooperation with the United Nations, the unhindered provision at scale of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to Palestinians throughout Gaza. But Israel breached the order. The problem is not that the Council adopted resolutions or that the ICJ ordered provisional measures, or that humanity has elaborated the rules that led the UN bodies to adopt these positions and which should be observed. The problem is that Israel can violate these rules, demands, and orders in full impunity. No one should arm or shield those committing atrocities. No one, no country should arm or shield those committing atrocities. They must be held accountable, or these crimes will continue. Faced with such outrage for its attack on foreign nationals from the World Central Kitchen, Israel took its first measures, dismissing 2 senior officers and reprimanding 3 others. That is the punishment for the commission of war crimes? That is outrageous. And who will be held accountable for all the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians killed? Is our lives not worthy of holding accountable those who murder us and kill us in large numbers? Madam President, history will remember that Israel continued to be present within these walls while trying to bring down the UN and the international law-based order this organization stands for, destroying and displacing an entire people and denying their right to existence and their state, unchecked and unhinged, while the state of Palestine committed to the rule of international law and to the just and lasting peace has yet to become a member of these United Nations. This is only one more injustice to which our people is being subjected to. One more contradiction between the clarity of the statements and the ambiguity of certain actions. There are no nuances, no ifs and buts, no justifications for what Israel is doing. None. Let me repeat. There are no nuances, no ifs and buts, no justification of what Israel is doing. None. And there is no justification for the continued denial of our right to self-determination and to freedom and dignity in our land. We knew, you all knew what was coming 6 months ago. We knew, and you knew, Israel would resort to mass and indiscriminate killing, to total destruction and devastation, that the famine was on the way. This genocide was announced by Israeli leaders. It was perpetrated in broad daylight. It was displayed on your own screens. It was discussed in your meetings. Many of you were mobilized to stop it, but there are still tools that were not used, not even considered. One day, as for other genocides, a lot will be said about these failures. But we cannot wait. Action is needed now, at every level, with every means possible. I call on you, individually and collectively, to do more now, to figure out a way to stop these massacres and this meditated killing of children and women and men. I call on you to bring immediate relief to desperate parents who have witnessed what no parent should endure, and children who have suffered what no children should suffer. For 260,000 minutes now, for 260,000 minutes now, our failures mean their death. That should be reason enough for us to do everything in our power to bring this tragedy to an end. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. I wish to begin by expressing Israel's sorrow over the tragic incident which claimed the lives of the World Central Kitchen employees in Gaza. We express our deepest condolences, and our hearts go out to the families, their countries, and the World Central Kitchen. This was a tragic mistake. Israel never targets civilians deliberately, never, let alone aid workers carrying out crucial work. Israel holds the critical support of aid workers in the highest regard, and we will continue to coordinate with them and secure them in their missions. This incident has been thoroughly investigated, and the findings show that this strike was carried out due to a misidentification at night during a war under very complex conditions. The incident was investigated by an independent expert body and was completed last night. The findings were presented both to Israeli leadership and WCK officials before being released to the public. As a result, 2 senior military officers have already been dismissed from their posts. Israel has coordinated aid distribution with international organizations thousands of times, I repeat, thousands of times since the start of this war. And there is no question that this event was not deliberate. The military's standard of operating procedure was violated, but it was the result of a tragic mistake made due to Hamas's cynical modus operandi to exploit civilian infrastructure and vehicles. Israel will learn from this investigation and take every effort to ensure that such a tragedy is not repeated. Council members, Israel is in the midst of a defensive war fought in unprecedented conditions against an enemy that fights from underground tunnels and hospitals and deliberately uses civilians as human shields. We did not start this war, and we did not want this war. We were attacked, massacred by ruthless terrorists that are committed to repeat the massacre. Hamas chose to fight from within civilian population centers in Gaza, and as heart-wrenching as it is, tragic mistakes can happen. Every country that fought a war in dense urban conditions understands this. Due to the complexity of the battlefield in Gaza, tragedies that took the lives of our own people have occurred. IDF soldiers, our soldiers, have fallen from friendly fire, and Israeli hostages, our hostages, have been mistakenly killed by our soldiers. These are all tragedies, but the reality is that the loss of innocent lives during a war is sometimes unavoidable, despite all the efforts that Israel goes above and beyond to take. This is why the world must not forget for one moment why this war began. Israel abides strictly by the laws of war, and the Israel Defense Forces have implemented more precautions to mitigate civilian harm than any other military in history. Israel dropped 7 million flyers warning civilians to evacuate. 13 million text messages have been sent. Military maps were even distributed outlining safe areas and evacuation routes. These measures are unprecedented, and I don't know of any other military that meets these standards. Our enemy, on the other hand, Hamas, cares nothing for the well-being of civilians and entrenches itself among civilian population, all in order to deliberately maximize the number of civilian fatalities in Gaza. This is their goal. Do you have anything to say about how Hamas turned Shifa Hospital into a terror base? Over the past weeks, hundreds of terrorists were neutralized and arrested, all inside a hospital. Does this council have anything to say about it? This is what Hamas is, an enemy that takes every effort to maximize civilian casualties. This is the script that they have written for you, so that you can pressure Israel into a ceasefire and save them. For Israel, every loss of life is a tragedy. Yet, for Hamas, the death of civilians is their strategy. We were the ones who were butchered, and we are now fighting to not be butchered again. If Hamas's terror capabilities are not obliterated, they will rearm, regroup, and recommit atrocities against Israelis until they annihilate us. That is exactly what they have been doing for the last 18 years, since we evacuated and disengaged from Gaza. Colleagues, no country wishes this war to end more than Israel. It is our children who are fighting in Gaza, making the ultimate sacrifice. But we have no other choice. The formula for an immediate ceasefire is clear. Hamas must turn themselves in and release all the hostages. If this is done, the war can end today. 182 days have passed, and this council still have not even condemned Hamas. Instead, you have demanded a ceasefire with no strings attached, a ceasefire that isn't conditioned on the return of the hostages. This is a free pass for barbarism and sadistic violence. Any ceasefire that ensures Hamas's survival is a green light for many more October 7th. You know that there can be no solution to the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians in our region as long as Hamas continues to rule in Gaza. But some members here prefer to ignore Hamas's genocidal ambitions. It's in their charter, by the way. If this council showed Hamas that terror is not tolerated and increased the pressure on them by, for example, designated Hamas as a terror organization, this war could end faster. Council member, not only is Hamas responsible for every casualty in Gaza, they are also responsible for the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Israel facilitates the constant entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. 19,000 aid trucks have already entered Gaza since the start of the war, carrying over 350,000 tons of aid, including 250,000 tons of food. Field and floating hospitals have been established, and no limits are placed on the amount of aid that can enter Gaza. No limits. The only reasons that the aid does not always reach the civilian population is because Hamas loots it and the UN is incapable of handling the capacity of supplies being brought in. At any given moment, there are hundreds, yes, hundreds of trucks held up on the Gazan side of the Kerem Shalom crossing, waiting to be received and distributed by aid agencies. The UN agencies failed to establish an effective distribution mechanism, but rather than taking responsibility, they blame Israel. Nevertheless, despite the lies, Israel is committed to making every effort to facilitate aid. Yesterday, as was pointed out by the Madam President, Israel's Security Cabinet decided to ramp up the amount of aid entering Gaza. More ports and crossings are opening, and we are taking measures that no other country at war has ever taken. Colleagues, while the UN was quick to forget the horrors of October 7th and chooses to focus only on the situation in Gaza, as we speak here now, there are over 100,000 Israelis displaced from their homes for more than 6 months with their children. Over 12,000 rockets have been fired at Israel from Gaza, and more than 3,500 rockets and missiles have been fired at Israel from our northern border, from Lebanon. Millions of Israelis are running back and forth from bomb shelters almost every day. 134 families are still praying for the return of their loved ones held hostage by Hamas, and the entire country is mourning the victims of the Hamas's massacre. Millions of Israelis face constant Palestinian terror attacks, but sadly, this is a fact that the UN chooses to neglect. After all, Israeli suffering means almost nothing between these walls. In each council meeting, a flawed picture is painted. You focus on Israel, making demands and issuing condemnations against Israel, while ignoring the terrorists that planned and initiated this war. And what should be done to thwart their genocidal schemes? This is also the responsibility of this council, the lives of Israelis, not only the lives of Palestinians, the future of Israelis. The Palestinian representative here does not represent Hamas and has no influence over them. He speaks only in the name of the Palestinian Authority that pays terrorists and up until this day never condemned the massacre. And the Palestinian Authority, as you know, has no presence in Gaza. So, dear colleagues, what does the Council have to say about the murderous Hamas terrorists, about the continuous rocket fire on Israel, about the exploitation of civilian sites for terror, like hospitals, about the looting of humanitarian aid, about women, Israeli women that are being raped right now in captivity and children being tortured? What steps are you taking against Hamas? Just because a representative of Hamas is not sitting in this room, does that mean that you can ignore their atrocities and exploitation of Gazans as human shields? These discussions, sadly, are completely detached from reality, even though the truth is so clear. When will the UN finally hold Hamas accountable? The time has come to stop defending terrorists. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel and pass the floor to the representative of Saudi Arabia.
سعادة رئيسة مجلس الأمن.
Your Excellency, Madam President of the Security Council, Ambassador Vanessa Perez, I have the pleasure and honor to give this statement on behalf of the Group of Arab States. At the outset, I would like to congratulate you on your assumption of the presidency of the Security Council this month, and I wish you success in your management of the Council's work. I also express our appreciation to OCHA's representative, Mr. Ramesh Rajasingham, and Madam Janti Sorindo, the representative of Save the Children. We thank them for the briefings on the famine and the targeting of humanitarian workers, because this is a matter that poses a great challenge to the international community and humanity as a whole. Madam President, 79 years have passed since the establishment of this August organization, which was established to enhance international work between states and organizations in a manner that serves humanity and lifts the lives of the peoples of Earth. However, and until this very day, we note that millions of people are confronting the specter of hunger and malnutrition, where repeated international reports indicate an increased number of hungry people around the world yearly, and this number has exceeded 700 million persons as the recent statistics of the WFP indicate. This requires organizations and states to work intensively to achieve one of the most important targets of sustainable development, namely the elimination of hunger. And here it is an important opportunity for me to offer our appreciation to the international humanitarian and aid organizations for the important work and sacrifices that they make to deliver urgent aid to those who need it throughout the world, with no consideration to religion, ethnicity, or race, or politics. Madam President, while international law stipulates that material and logistic support to humanitarian and relief organizations throughout the world is required, the entire world was shocked 2 days ago in the besieged Gaza Strip with an incident that is not new to those who perpetrated. The Israeli war machine has targeted a humanitarian aid convoy belonging to the World Central Kitchen. This blatant attack led to the death of persons of multiple nationalities, whose only crime was that they were attempting to deliver aid to the Palestinian people. There is no doubt that this incident is simply more evidence to be added to the record of the violations perpetrated by the Israeli occupying power against humanitarian aid workers. The total number of victims among humanitarian workers has reached a number that we can no longer remain silent over as the international community. This is a dangerous precedent that violates all international rules and customs and charters. Therefore, the Group of Arab States condemns in the strongest terms the crimes that were perpetrated against the World Central Kitchen's staff and other workers in the delivery of relief and aid, who have sacrificed their lives to serve innocents that are confronting the danger of death because they are being systematically starved, and because this starvation and hunger is being used as a weapon in this crisis, as the Israeli occupation continues to close crossings and to prevent the entry of food, water, medicine, and fuel. And it targets Palestinian civilians when they attempt to reach this food aid, and this has happened on more than one occasion. All of these events have exacerbated the already catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and has caused a large number of Palestinians, especially children and those who are infirm and women to fall victim to it. This is something that is condemned by the Arab group as it is a war crime in the eyes of the international humanitarian law, and the Israeli occupation must be held fully responsible for it. Madam President, this massacre is further damning evidence on the genocide that the Israeli occupying government is pursuing in its military operations in Gaza. Therefore, the Arab group calls for an international investigation in this incident, which comes 6 months after the start of the Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip. An aggression that has led to the martyrdom so far of over 33,000 Palestinians and has wounded over 75,000 others, most of whom are women and children. Moreover, this latest incident has taken place despite the continued international calls and condemnation and the resolutions adopted by this Council calling for an immediate ceasefire and for the delivery of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people who are facing the danger of a real famine because of Israel's intransigence. The most recent of these Security Council decisions was Resolution 2728, adopted by this Council on the 25th of March, and which called for an immediate ceasefire during the holy month of Ramadan. The Arab group calls upon this Council to take a resolution under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter to secure that Israel, the occupying power, would abide by a ceasefire and to giving access to humanitarian aid and to putting an end to the evil aggression on the Palestinian people and providing protection for them. The Arab group stresses the need for this Council to undertake its mandated role to make the occupying state abide by relevant Security Council resolutions and to abide by international law and international humanitarian law. And the two orders issued by the ICJ recently in the case of the genocide that Israel is perpetrating against the Palestinian people. The Arab group affirms that it will continue its efforts at all levels and in all international fora to help the Security Council undertake its main responsibility of maintaining international peace and security, and to guarantee that the Israeli occupying state would commit to an immediate and permanent ceasefire and commit to allowing the unhindered entry of humanitarian aid while giving the necessary protection to the Palestinian people and to humanitarian aid workers so that they would be able to perform their noble task. Madam President, the Arab group confirms its support for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, the UNRWA, which has an irreplaceable role that is a lifeline for over 2 million Palestinians who are living an unprecedented catastrophe in Gaza. The group of Arab states here condemns the fact that the Israeli occupation army has killed over 176 UNRWA staff since the beginning of the Israeli aggression on the Gaza Strip. We value the decision taken by a group of friendly states to resume their support for the UNRWA so that it is better able to perform its role in confronting the humanitarian disaster caused by the Israeli aggression on Gaza, and so that it can continue to help refugees in the agency's 5 areas of operation. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Saudi Arabia and pass the floor to the representative of Australia.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to address you today. Australia is horrified by the trajectory of the conflict and catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. Throughout, Australia has called for restraint, the protection of civilians, and safe, unimpeded access for life-saving humanitarian assistance. Instead, more than 1 million Palestinians are on the brink of famine, and more than 30,000 civilians and 190 humanitarian workers have been killed. Among those aid workers are Australian Zomi Frankencom and her World Central Kitchen colleagues, killed while carrying out urgent and vital support to the people of Gaza. The death of any aid worker in such circumstances is outrageous, unacceptable and creates further dangers for civilian populations. Wartime does not obviate responsibility for observing international law. We have made clear to the Netanyahu government that we expect a thorough, genuine and transparent investigation and full accountability. We call for all parties to the conflict to comply with Security Council Resolution 2728. We acknowledge the opening of additional border crossings by Israel. This must translate into massive and sustained increases in humanitarian aid reaching those in need. We repeat our demands for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire leading to a sustainable ceasefire. Hostages must be released, civilians must be protected, and aid must flow. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Australia and pass the floor to the representative of Poland.
Madam President, Poland follows with great concern the current devastating crisis in the Middle East. We know very well the consequences of war, invasion and terror, which are felt for generations. This day we have been profoundly shocked by deadly strike on World Central Kitchen convoy, which took lives of 7 aid workers. One of the fatal victims of the attack was a Polish citizen, Damian Sobul. Madam President, please allow me to say a few words about our citizen, Mr. Sobul. He was a volunteer with a long-standing commitment to humanitarian causes, who was involved in providing aid to people not only in Gaza, but also in the other parts of the world, including Turkey, Morocco, and Ukraine. Please allow me, Madam President, to convey from this chamber our deepest condolences to the family and friends of Mr. Sobul. We extend these condolences to the families and close ones of all other humanitarian workers who have lost their lives in this horrific event. May their souls rest in peace. The details of attack revealed by media are deeply disturbing. The strike happened along the road used to transit aid through Gaza, which was supposed to be a deconflicted area. In spite of the fact that the transport had been notified to the Israeli army, it was hit 3 times by the IDF. Madam President, on October the 7th, Poland was shocked by the Hamas brutal attacks. Polish authorities at all levels have condemned them in the strongest possible terms. Our position remains unchanged. We see the use of innocent civilians as human shields as particularly repulsive, and we constantly call for a release of all hostages without any preconditions. We constantly stress that Israel, just like any other state, has the right to defend itself. But we also stressed that the right of self-defense must be exercised in full compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law. Therefore, self-defense must not result in the suffering of the innocent civilians, nor in the death of those who come to help them. And this is why, since the very beginning of the escalation of the conflict after October the 7th, Poland reiterates that it is imperative to address humanitarian needs of civilian population suffering in Gaza. Madam President, for decades, Poland has been active in humanitarian and development aid projects in the Middle East, with particular focus on Palestine and Lebanon. But it is important to stress that humanitarian help cannot be provided without safe access and safe working conditions for the United Nations humanitarian agencies and international humanitarian organizations. Humanitarian workers must be protected at all times in line with international law. Meanwhile, the members of humanitarian organizations in Gaza are in constant danger and are not able to perform their work. Madam President, today we pay tribute to the heroism of Damian Sobul and his commitment to helping those suffering and those in need. We also pay tribute to all other employees and volunteers of humanitarian and aid missions who sacrificed their lives. International law must be upheld, and even in the times of conflict. Resolutions adopted by the Security Council regarding the humanitarian situation in Gaza must be respected. There are common values and rules. In this vein, we call on Israel to conduct a swift, full and transparent investigation and hold those responsible fully to account. To conclude, Madam President, Poland reiterates its unwavering commitment to peace and stability in the Middle East. We are strongly in favor of a robust coordination of all efforts to restore calm in the region. Preventing a regional spillover and restoring calm in the Middle East is now more urgent than ever before. We believe that the UN community should be able to develop a common position on this extremely important issue. Otherwise, The escalation and spreading of the conflict may have devastating and long-lasting consequences that we all would like to avert. And I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Poland. There are no more names inscribed in the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.